Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances across the front line. In the Kursk region, the Russians have captured the majority of a settlement. In the Kupiansk direction there are several Russian advances, as well as in the direction of Liman along the Serbets river line. In the Kurakhove section of the front line there are several Russian advances from the north, east and south. And to the west of Velyka Novosilka there are additional Russian advances. Starting out in the Kursk region, the Russians have managed to capture the majority of Kurakhove, pushing the Ukrainians into a smaller pocket in the northern outskirts of the settlement, following the capture of the majority of the area. The Ukrainians are now with a few supply lines across the Sel River, with the Russian positions almost entirely surrounding the Ukrainian positions by putting them in a semi-encirclement, as they have been doing for a long time following their capture of the Ukrainian positions north by the Sel River line. In that direction, it allowed the Russians to have a large semi-encirclement of the Ukrainian forces. They have now simply reduced that significantly to push the Ukrainians into a very small pocket just by the Sel River. With this, the Russians are likely to capture the remaining parts very soon and push the Ukrainians back across, or what survives of the Ukrainian units operating in the area. In the remaining parts in the Kursk region, there's not a lot of developments, but the very heavy fighting continues in the northern and northwestern outskirts of the fighting in the area. Further south, the Russians have managed to advance in the east of Sinkivka, capturing another forest line and pushing the Ukrainians back to the next line of defense, which is taking place here to the northeast of Petropavlivka, with a lot of fortified positions in between that and Velyka Novosilka. The Russians have also advanced north of Kostelnikivka, capturing the remaining parts of the forest patch near Kostelnikivka, with now the fighting entering Hlushkivka in a wide area from the eastern to the western outskirts of the settlement. The Russians are slowly moving up northwards from Kostelnikivka towards Hlushkivka, where they will advance along the railways and the main road in the northern direction to then move on to Novosilove, Sharivka, and so on, all the way up to Kupiansk, in an attempt to cut off the Ukrainian forces in between Novosilivka and Kupiansk, here to the east of the Uska river line. The Ukrainians are practically already in a pocket, but if the Russians gain physical control over the Uska river line, they'll be able to completely encircle the Ukrainian forces and prevent any sort of withdrawal or resupply of those forces. Moving further south along the Serbets river line, the Russians have advanced further within Terni, capturing approximately 50% of the settlement, and are now within close proximity to the final road in and out of Terni from the eastern direction. This will lead to the Russians capturing the remaining parts of the settlement and moving into Yampolivka, where fighting is also reaching the forest patches east of that settlement as well, which will lead to a combined strike of Russian forces along the entirety of Yampolivka and Terni from the northern and eastern directions. The Ukrainians are, however, so far showing fierce resistance, preventing the Russians from quickly taking control over these settlements and instead slowing them down significantly, preventing them from gaining any significant breakthroughs. The objective of the Ukrainians here is to slow down the Russians as much as possible to prevent the collapse of the front line here near the Sibris river line. However, if the Russians do gain control over Terni and Yampolivka, the siege of Torske and Sarishne would then begin, which would then put the positions of the Ukrainians operating in the Serbyansky forest area here south of Kremenna at risk due to the operational encirclement that would entail. Gaining control over Torske would allow the Russians to cut off the supplies to those and encircle them from the northern direction. Securing the Serbyansky forest area would allow the Russians to then launch offensive operations towards Liman, capturing which would be a significant blow to the Ukrainian positions in the northern direction and allow the Russians to capture the entire area east of the Uska river line, north of the Severodonetsk river line. Moving further south, we see here in the direction northwest of Selidova, the Russians are slightly expanding northwest and southwest of Petrivka in the direction of Pustinka, where the Russians' objective is to attack the settlement from the northern and eastern directions At the same time as fighting is happening within Yurivka itself, the Russians are storming both settlements at the same time, with these operations coming from Petrivka and Novoolexivka. At the same time, the Russians continue offensive operations here in the direction of Kurakhove, capturing the first line of defense east of Kurakhove and marching on towards the second line of defense as Russians are fighting over Dalnie to the south of Kurakhove and the fortified positions to the east of the settlement, at the same time as fighting continues within the eastern parts of the settlement, where the Russians now control approximately 15% of Kurakhove. With this heavy fighting, the Ukrainian positions here east of Kurakhove are slowly deteriorating, which would then allow the Russians to enter the settlement in the southern outskirts, where the high-rise apartment complex buildings are, combining an assault from the south with an assault from the east, with the limited supply coming in and out of Kurakhove, with the Russian positions nearby allowing for strikes on the supply lines of the Ukrainians, and with the physically cut roads south of Kurakhove. If the Russians capture Dalnie, the supply situation would be very limited in Kurakhove and would force the Ukrainians to withdraw from the settlement. When the Russians formed these cauldrons along and around settlements, the Ukrainians have the choice between attempting a withdrawal where approximately half or even more than half could survive, but they would give up a well-fortified position. The alternative is they hold out for as long as possible, slowing down the Russian forces, but in the end, little to no one would survive such a last stand position. Therefore, the Russians, forming two cauldrons with a push towards Dalnie, forces several Ukrainian brigades to withdraw, both the ones in the southern direction near the river line and the ones in the northern direction near Kurakhove. Both of these would be forced to withdraw, and both of these include approximately 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers. If both of these pockets suffered the same fate as the Ukrainian defenders of Volodar, then the Ukrainians would cut those 10,000 soldiers to 5,000 soldiers from these encirclements. And this would significantly decrease the Ukrainian defensive capabilities in the area and require significant reinforcements to be sent to this section of the front line to strengthen their positions. At the same time as the Russians capture the first line of defense at Kurakhove, the Russians have also managed to capture a large section of the front line north of Antonivka in an attempt to close the gap further and strengthen their push towards Dalnie. The Russians are here securing the road towards Dalnie from Pobieda and are moving towards flanking the Ukrainian positions in the village chain here along the river line. The Ukrainians are here slowly withdrawing towards the settlements, from which they'll withdraw further towards Kurakhove and the rear to prevent an encirclement of their forces. This will be a slow process as the Russians move closer and closer and fight them in their retreat. At the same time, the Russians are also closing in on the southern flank of the river line, where they're moving towards Yelisavetivka, Vesely, and Trudove from the south. Moving further west, we see here in the direction of Velyka Novosilka, the Russians are moving closer towards Novodarivka, where fighting is now taking place on the western outskirts of the settlement. In a combined strike from the south and from the west, the Russians are storming Novodarivka in an attempt to gain full control over the settlement, which will then allow the Russians to move further towards Novopil in the northern direction, capturing which would cut off the road here west of Velyka Novosilka towards Zaporizhia. In general, what we see is that the Russians are here slowly building up offensive operations to create a second pocket west of Kurakhove in the direction of Velyka Novosilka. The objective here is to create some sort of pocket where the Ukrainian forces in Velyka Novosilka and the Remevsky Lech is being pressured from both flanks to a point at which the Russians will look to gain control over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the area, completely cutting off the supplies into one single supply road in and out of the settlement, to which the Russians would have direct fire control of. Therefore, there is a significant possibility that the objective of the Russians here is to close the supply road in and out of Velyka Novosilka, semi-encircling the settlement to gain control of it, pushing the Ukrainians out into a road that is directly in the fire control of the Russian forces, inflicting heavy casualties on them, securing the southern parts of the Donetsk region in the southwestern outskirts. Combined with the capture of Kurakhove, the Russians could then at that point move towards further northwards into the flank of Pokrovsk, into the Dnipropetrovsk region, flanking it from the west, or directly in the northern direction towards Pokrovsk, or both of them at the same time. In general, the Ukrainian defensive capabilities in the Dnipropetrovsk region is significantly weaker than that of the Donetsk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.